The wind came first. It always did. Before the chaos, before the orders, before the first crack of a rifle splitting open the silence of a desert morning, there was the wind.
Sir, the
Low
manifest is
and
complete.
patient,
Good. Stick
moving
to the
across
plan,
the
no
ridgeline
deviations.
like
Yes,
something
sir.
alive,
Dismissed.
something with memory. It pressed against the scrub brush and made a sound that most people would never notice. A frequency just below the threshold of attention. A whisper that wasn't quite a whisper. Reeve Weston noticed it. She always had. She was lying flat on a limestone shelf at the top of the world, her small body pressed into the cold rock like she had grown from it. The ghillie suit covered her completely, breaking her silhouette into something organic, something that belonged to the mountain. Her right eye was behind the scope of a Shytac M200. Her left eye was closed. Her breathing was slow and deep and deliberate. The breathing of someone who had made peace with the moment before it arrived. The valley below was disappearing. A wall of sand 3,000 feet high was swallowing the desert whole, erasing the horizon in a bruised curtain of brown and amber. Inside that wall, somewhere on the canyon floor 3 kilometers away, 8 men were about to die, unless she stopped it. She dialed the turret of the Shytac with 2 fingers, feeling the microscopic clicks travel up through her fingertips and into her palm. The crosshairs settled. The wind pressed against her left cheek. She listened to it, not with instruments, not with the handheld kestrel still clipped to her chest rig, with something older than instruments, something her father had spent 18 years teaching her to use. She exhaled, long, slow, complete. Wind reads clean, 3,050 meters, a pause the length of a heartbeat. Sending. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle erupted. The recoil punched through her shoulder like a closed fist. The sound of the shot was swallowed instantly by the howling desert. She stayed on the scope, watching, counting. 1, 2, 3. The figure on the opposing ridge dropped. No drama, no warning, just there, and then not there. The way a candle goes out. She cycled the bolt. 8 to go. 48 hours earlier, the desert smelled like jet fuel and old metal, and the particular brand of heat that only existed at forward operating bases. The kind of heat that felt personal, like the sun had decided to make an example of you specifically. Reeve Weston stepped off the rear ramp of a C-130 transport and immediately squinted against the glare. She didn't shield her eyes. She never shielded her eyes. She just let them adjust, standing at the edge of the ramp while the rest of the aircraft's cargo was unloaded around her. A duffel bag hung from her right shoulder, thick canvas straps cutting into her trapezius, pulling her center of gravity hard to one side. She didn't adjust it. She carried heavier. FOB Iron Gate sat at the edge of nowhere, the kind of nowhere that had a name on a classified map, but no name anywhere else. The tarmac was busy with the organized chaos of a base running at operational tempo. Mechanics moved between vehicles. Personnel crossed between structures with the heads-down purpose of people who had too much to do in too little time. No one paid attention to the C-130. No one paid attention to the single figure who stepped off it and stood for a moment in the full weight of the afternoon sun. No one, except the 8 men leaning in the shade of the nearest hangar. They were large in the way that only years of deliberate physical training produced. The kind of large that wasn't bulk, but density. They wore civilian clothes over their tactical gear, the half-dressed look of operators who'd been awake for 30 hours and stopped caring about appearances somewhere around hour 20. Their arms were mapped with tattoos. Their faces were covered in the tactical beards that had become as much a part of the Special Operations uniform as the equipment itself. SEAL Team Bravo, the best trained, most capable direct action unit currently assigned to FOB Iron Gate. They saw Reeve. She saw them see her. She kept walking. The man who spoke first had a voice calibrated for carrying across distances. He didn't lower it. He wasn't trying to be subtle. Subtlety wasn't the point. Is that our support element? A pause, constructed for comedic effect. Command sent us a mascot. Laughter. The specific laughter of men who feel entirely comfortable in their environment. Sharp, effortless, inclusive of everyone except the person it was aimed at. Reeve Weston did not break stride. She had heard this exact laugh in boot camp. She had heard it in sniper school, where she'd finished top of her class and still walked into the graduation briefing to find two male classmates actively arguing that her scores were a clerical error. She had heard it at every deployment prep, every mission briefing, every forward base she had ever set foot on. The laugh was universal. It crossed unit lines and rank structures and geographic locations. It was the laugh that said, "You are here by mistake, and we are waiting for someone to correct it." She crossed the distance to the man at the center of the group with the flat-footed walk of someone who had nothing to prove and therefore didn't waste energy proving it. He was enormous, 6'4", maybe more, eyes like chipped gray stone. His name tape read Harmon. The silver bar on his chest rig read Lieutenant. The way the other 7 men unconsciously oriented toward him read something more complex than rank. Reeve stopped in front of him. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She did it without hesitation. "Specialist Reeve Weston," she said, "attached scout sniper for the upcoming operation." She extended her orders with her right hand. The silence that followed had texture. She felt it against her skin like the heat off the tarmac. Harmon took the papers. He read them slowly. Not the speed of a man absorbing information, the speed of a man performing disbelief for an audience. He flipped pages with the deliberate pace of someone who had already decided the ending and was simply taking his time arriving there. Then he looked back down at her. His gaze moved from her boots to the top of her helmet, which was a half size too large and sat fractionally crooked on her head. He took in her height, 5 feet 1 inch. Her weight, 122 pounds soaking wet with full kit. Her face, which was young and controlled and gave away nothing. "You're the sniper," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the verbal equivalent of the same file drop, an acknowledgement delivered with exactly enough inflection to function as an insult. Command said they were sending support. He paused, searching. "Not a doll." The voice came from behind him. Kowalski, Sergeant Rex Kowalski, the team's heavy weapons specialist, who was the size of a refrigerator and had a voice to match. He said it without looking up from the barrel he was cleaning. Casual, taxonomic, like naming a species. "They sent us a doll." A sound moved through the group. Not quite laughter. Something more settled than that. The sound of a verdict being rendered without a trial. Harmon let the paper drop the last 2 inches to her hand. She caught it. "My qualification scores are in the file, Lieutenant," she said. "I don't care about scores on a paper target, Weston." He crossed his arms. The gesture was not aggressive. It was dismissive, which was worse. "We hump 80-pound rucksacks 20 clicks into bad country. We move." "Fine." She felt. "Copy that, Lieutenant," she said to no one but the wind. She walked toward the barracks. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the baked earth behind her. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and the world turned into maps. The TOC was a large canvas structure reinforced with aluminum framing, humming with the refrigerated air of 3 industrial cooling units working against the Arizona heat. Screens covered the north wall. She was foot patrol, 3 clicks south. We enter Diablo Canyon at 0200 hours. Target compound is set against the eastern canyon wall. Rapid entry, secure the HVT, extract before sunrise. The team nodded. It was standard. Clean, direct, vertical. The kind of plan that looked elegant on a map. Reeve looked at the contour lines. She looked at the elevation gradients on either side of the proposed route. She traced the proposed path with her finger without touching the screen. It's a natural amphitheater. Anyone with a firing position on either ridge has unobstructed sight lines into the entire approach corridor. If you take contact down there, there's no cover. The boulders on the canyon floor provide concealment, not protection. Rounds will penetrate. We move under darkness, Harmon said. Thermal advantage. And we have drone assets on station for close air support. Reeve pulled out her Kestrel weather meter from her chest rig. She didn't ask permission. She set it on the table and pointed to the readout. Meteorological forecast for the next 12 hours shows a high probability of haboob formation. If the storm arrives during your insertion window, air assets are grounded. Thermal imaging becomes significantly degraded in high particulate conditions. You would be navigating blind in a valley, while the opposing terrain holds every tactically significant high point. For a moment, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been before. Not dismissive quiet, listening quiet. She felt it, the brief opening, the space where data was doing what data was supposed to do. Then Kowalski's hand came down on the table, weight shifting onto it, his large frame casually filling the space in front of the display. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the map, but she could no longer see it clearly, and they both knew that was the point. She withdrew her hand slowly. There is an overwatch position here. She pointed to the eastern ridge, to the jagged peak she had identified the moment she first saw the terrain. Hill 3050. If I insert early and climb to that ridgeline, I can provide coverage of the entire approach corridor and the target compound, even if the weather turns, even if air support is grounded. I have a clean line of sight to every significant fire position in the valley. Harmon set the marker down. He walked around the table toward her, stopping at a distance that required her to look up. This is a direct action raid, he said. Speed and violence of action. I don't need a support sniper on a solo hiking expedition 3 kilometers off my axis of advance. I'm not asking for support, she said. I'm offering to clear your path. Your job, he said, and his voice dropped to the specific register that meant conversation over, is to trail the formation, cover our 6, and stay out of the way. If I need a long gun, I'll ask for it. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Until then, your luggage. Copy? The tent went entirely silent. Reeve held his eyes. She didn't break them first. She didn't look down. She looked at the map one more time, at Hill 3050 sitting above the canyon like a watchtower no one was bothering to occupy. At the fire positions that would command the entire valley to anyone with the elevation to use them. She looked at all of it, then she stepped back. Copy that, Lieutenant, she said, trailing and observing. Harmon nodded. Order restored. He turned back to the table. The team resumed its work with the practiced efficiency of men who had already forgotten she was in the room. Reeve turned and walked out of the tent. The night air outside was warm and electric. The stars to the west were already hazed with a thin layer of high dust, the leading edge of something bigger building beyond the horizon. She could taste it on the back of her tongue. The particular metallic taste of air before a haboob. Copper and ancient earth. They were going to walk into a trap. She was the only one who could see it coming. And they had just made it explicitly clear that she was luggage. The barracks were a long, prefabricated structure that smelled of canvas and gun oil, and the specific staleness of a building too many people had slept in. Reeves' bunk was at the far end, in the overflow section, separated from the main team bay by a plywood partition that reached 2 feet short of the ceiling and blocked nothing except the illusion of privacy. She sat on the edge of the cot with the chai tack disassembled across her lap, moving through the cleaning process the way she had done it every night since she was 12 years old. The barrel, the bolt, the firing mechanism, each component examined, cleaned, reassembled. It was not maintenance. It was meditation. She picked up her phone. The screen showed 1 bar of signal, barely enough. She dialed. It rang 3 times. Hey, baby girl. The voice on the other end was rough and unhurried. Garrett Weston sounded like Wyoming, like cold mornings and long distances, and the particular patience of a man who had spent decades waiting for things that were worth waiting for. He was 61 years old, and his voice carried the weight of it in the best possible way. "Hey, Dad, you sound tired." "I am tired." "Rough landing?" She thought about the tarmac, about the laugh that carried across open air, about the file dropped at precisely the wrong height. "Something like that." There was a pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that existed between people who had learned they didn't need to fill silence with noise. "You hear the wind yet?" he asked. It was the question he had asked her before every deployment, before every significant event, really, going back to the first time he had taken her out to the flat pasture behind their property in Wyoming with a .22 rifle and a handmade target and the kind of patience that most fathers reserve for things they considered important. She had been 8 years old. Her mother had been gone for a year. "Not yet," she said. "Not completely." "You will, no doubt in it." Not encouragement exactly, just the statement of a fact he had no reason to question. Same way your mother used to. She'd stand out in the yard on windy mornings and just listen. I asked her once what she was listening for. A small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She said she didn't know. She just knew it was important. Reeve pressed the phone against her ear. The Chi-Tac barrel lay cool and heavy across her forearm. "She never knew what she was doing," Garrett continued. "She just did it." A pause. "You knew what you were doing before you were 10 years old. You just had to believe it." After the call ended, Reeve sat in the dark for a long time. The generator outside hummed. Through the gap beneath the partition, she could hear the low voices of the team in the main bay, the sound of cards being dealt, the particular easy rhythm of men who trusted each other completely. She opened the small tactical notebook she carried in her left breast pocket. She turned to the last page, wrote a single line, the way she had written single lines before other missions, other mountains, other moments when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. "They see 5 feet 1. I see 3,050 meters." She closed the notebook, checked the Chi-Tac one final time, set her alarm for 0330, closed her eyes. In the main team bay, after the card game broke up and the lights went low, Corpsman Dex Callum sat alone at the small field desk near the door. The rest of the team was asleep, or close to it. He had Weston's personnel file open in front of him. He had pulled it during the briefing, quietly, while Harmon was still drawing red lines on the canyon map. He read through the scores section slowly. Sniper school, first in class. Margin over the second-place finisher, significant. Range qualification at 2,800 meters, clean. Wind variable testing, a set of notations that the evaluating instructor had circled and added 2 words to in the margin. Exceptional. Verify. The follow-up verification score was higher. Callum sat back in his chair. He looked at the plywood partition that separated the overflow section from the main bay. He thought about the woman on the other side of it. 122 pounds, 5 feet 1 inch, carrying a rifle that weighed 35 pounds before optics and ammunition. He had not laughed on the tarmac. He had come close. The reflex was social, not malicious, and it was hard to override. But something had stopped him. The way she walked, maybe? The way she didn't look at them when she heard it. Not because she was hurt, because she had already accounted for it and moved past it. Like a sniper accounting for wind drift. You don't stop the wind. You aim for where the bullet needs to be after the wind has done its work. He closed the file. He said nothing to anyone. Not then. But he remembered. They moved out at 0400. The dark was complete, the stars invisible behind a thickening haze, and the air had taken on the charged, metallic quality that Reeve had tasted the night before. The haboob was building. Not arriving, not yet. Building. The way a wave builds before it breaks. Harmon set the pace immediately. It was not a patrol pace. It was a statement. Long strides, ground-eating and relentless. The movement of men who were physically capable of sustaining this speed across difficult terrain and wanted everyone to know it. Reeve took her position at the rear of the column, drag position, the slowest part of the formation on paper, the most exposed in reality. She was covering their tracks, watching their six, fulfilling the role she had been assigned with the specific deliberateness of someone who intended to fulfill every role she was assigned to its fullest extent and beyond. The terrain was broken limestone and loose shale, the kind of surface that punished inattention with rolled ankles and punished weight distribution errors with falls. The shy tack on her back was not just weight, it was geometry. Its length changed her center of gravity, altered the way she had to navigate every incline and technical step. Add the body armor and water and survival kit, and she was moving with nearly 70% of her body weight. Her thighs burned at the 20-minute mark. Her lungs were processing the dry, particulate heavy air like they were breathing through a filter. The straps of her ruck cut into her trapezius muscles with a patient, grinding persistence that she knew from experience would become numbness and then become something she stopped noticing. She did not slow down. Kowalski was ahead of her, his massive frame moving with the effortless power of a man built for exactly this. At the 40-minute mark, he paused on a scree slope, looked back, and watched her struggle for purchase on the loose stone, the barrel of the shy tack catching on a low scrub branch. "Heavy load," he said, his voice carrying the specific tone of something that sounded practical, but wasn't. He extended a hand toward the rifle. "Let me take the cannon. You look like you're about to snap." It was not an offer. It was a test. If she accepted, she ceased to be a soldier and became a passenger. She became the thing they already believed she was. Reeves' hand came up and pushed his away. Sharp, decisive. The sound of it was like a dry twig snapping in cold air. "Touch my weapon and you lose a finger," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely without ambiguity. "I carry my own kills." Kowalski blinked. He had not expected that particular quality of response. He held his hands up in brief mock surrender and turned back to the slope. The smirk was gone. Reeve adjusted her footing, drove her boots into the gravel, and pushed herself upward. The anger was better than the exhaustion. She burned it like fuel. They crested the ridge as the last light was dying in the west, and what Reeves saw there stopped something inside her with cold finality. The western horizon was gone. Where the sky should have met the earth, there was instead a wall. A solid, churning curtain of suspended earth, thousands of feet high, moving across the desert with the unhurried certainty of something that had been moving across deserts for 10,000 years, and would be moving across them long after everyone standing on this ridge was dust. The haboob. Not a probability, not a forecast, a wall. She pulled her kestrel from her rig. The barometric pressure was dropping fast. Wind was already building at their elevation, gusting against the exposed ridgeline in hot, abrasive waves. She scanned the ground near their position automatically, the forensic habit of someone trained to read landscapes. Near a jagged limestone outcrop to her left, she stopped. The natural pattern of the desert floor, its random scatter of stone and wind-smooth sand, was interrupted. In the sheltered lee of the rock, where the wind had not yet erased the evidence, there was a depression in the hard-packed crust. Tire tracks. She crouched, ran one gloved fingertip along the edge of the impression. The walls of the track were sharp, not weathered, not eroded by wind or time, fresh. The tread pattern was wide and deep, not civilian, not the narrow tracks of a pickup running guns through a backcountry corridor. These were run-flat combat tires. The compression depth in the hard-packed earth spoke to a vehicle fully loaded with gear, with men, with weapons. She scanned wider without moving, overlapping impressions, multiple vehicles, 3, maybe 4, all moving on the same heading, toward the ridgeline above Diablo Canyon. "Lieutenant," she didn't call over the radio. He was 15 feet away. She called it into the open air with a specific tone that meant, "This is not a question." Harmon stopped. turned, walked back to her with the studied patience of a man who had already decided the category this interruption belonged to. He looked at what she was pointing at. Smuggling corridor, he said. Guns or product. Local operators in old Soviet trucks. Doesn't indicate the target is compromised. 3 to 4 vehicles, fully loaded, less than 2 hours ago. She kept her voice level, clinical, data, not argument, moving directly toward the high ground above our insertion route. If they're setting a prepared position above the canyon, then our drone assets would have flagged heat signatures before the weather shut them down. Harmon straightened. He checked his watch. We're burning time. We go low. We go fast. We're out before sunrise. If those vehicles are on the ridge above us, negative. The word landed like something solid, final. Into the valley, double time. He turned and signaled the team forward. They descended without hesitation. 8 men moving with the confidence of people who had never yet been wrong in a way they couldn't survive. Reeves stood on the ridge. The wind pressed against her from the west, hot and electric and carrying the copper taste of what was coming. She looked at the descending team. She looked at the tire tracks. She looked west at the wall consuming the sky. Then she looked east. Hill 3050 rose above the canyon like a sentinel, dark and jagged against the dying light, its ridgeline offering exactly the field of fire she had described in the TOC. Complete coverage of the approach corridor. Sight lines into the compound and every significant position on the opposing ridge. Unoccupied. She felt the particular sensation in her gut that she had learned, at significant cost, to take seriously. Not fear, something quieter and more reliable than fear. The same sensation she'd felt before an IED strike 3 years ago that she had no tactical reason to expect and every biological reason to trust. The silence before the cage door closes. She looked at Harmon's retreating back. He was not going to listen. Not until the first bullet passed close enough to make listening feel like survival. Reeve made a decision. She did not follow the formation down into the canyon. She shifted the Shytax weight on her back, tightened the left shoulder strap, and turned to face the eastern cliff face. The rock was sheer and dark and indifferent. The wind pushed against her from the wrong direction. She keyed her radio to the lowest possible volume. "Going dark," she said to no one who was listening. "Radio check on the hour." Then she reached for the first handhold and began to climb. One small shadow separating from the formation, moving upward as the rest of the world moved down, moving toward the dark as the storm consumed the light. The mountain didn't care about her rank. It didn't care about her height. It only respected her grip. The rock face did not welcome her. It did not reject her either. It simply existed, indifferent and absolute, presenting its vertical surface to anyone foolish enough to attempt it with the same blank patience it had offered to wind and rain in time for 10,000 years. The limestone was cold under her gloves, colder than the air, and it had the particular texture of old stone that had been shaped by forces operating on geological timescales rather than human ones. Sharp where it had fractured, smooth where water had moved across it in centuries past. Completely uninterested in whether Reeve Weston lived or died on its surface. She found the first hold with her left hand, a crack in the face roughly 3 inches wide and 2 inches deep, enough for the first 2 knuckles. She tested it. Solid. She found the first foothold with her right boot, a narrow ledge of projecting stone 6 inches above the canyon floor. She shifted her weight onto it. She began to climb. Harmon's voice arrived in her earpiece almost immediately. She had expected it. She had not turned the radio off because cutting communication entirely was a different category of decision, one that moved from tactical insubordination towards something that could follow her out of the desert and into a courtroom. She kept the volume low enough that his words were shapes rather than content. The anger in them was legible regardless. She did not acknowledge. She climbed. The ShyTac M200 was strapped across her back in its drag bag, barrel down, the weight of it distributed across both shoulders and her lower back by a rigging system she had modified over 3 deployments to sit as close to her center of gravity as possible. In flat terrain, it worked well. On a vertical surface, it was a different calculation entirely. The rifle shifted with every upward lunge, its mass pulling her backward, away from the rock face, demanding compensation from muscles that were already operating at their limit after 40 minutes of hard patrol. She compensated. She had no other option. At 80 feet, the shale became looser. A band of younger rock layered over the ancient limestone, less consolidated, prone to fracturing under pressure. She tested each hold twice before trusting it. Her progress slowed. The wind, which had been building steadily since they crested the ridge, found the cliff face and began to use it as an amplifier. It came across the exposed face in irregular gusts, each one pushing against her back with enough force to require active counterbalancing. At 140 feet, her right boot dislodged a section of shale the size of a dinner plate. She heard it fall. The sound of it descending was surprisingly long. She did not look down. At 190 feet, her left hand found what appeared to be a solid edge, and was not. The rock sheared away from the face with a sound like a gunshot, and for a single, complete moment she had nothing. No left handhold. Her weight transferred entirely to her right hand, 3 fingers jammed into a crack barely deep enough to hold them, and the full load of her body and her rifle pulling her away from the mountain with patient, merciless insistence. She did not fall, but the decision not to fall was not passive. It was active, immediate, and executed in the fraction of a second between losing the hold and losing the wall entirely. Her right arm absorbed the weight, while her left hand swept across the rock face in a controlled arc, searching, fingertips reading the surface. The ShyTac swung hard to her left, shifting the balance, and she drove her right knee into the rock to compensate, the pain sharp and immediate and irrelevant. Her left hand found a crack. 2 fingers in. Not enough. She worked a 3rd finger into the gap, felt the rock bite into the joint, and held. She hung there, suspended 200 feet above the canyon floor, the wind pressing against her back, her arms burning with a deep structural fatigue that went past muscle and into tendon. Her fingers slick with the blood that had been seeping through the shredded fingertips of her gloves since the first 40 feet of climbing. She did not make a sound. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. She found her next foothold. She pressed her boot into it. She drove herself upward. The mountain didn't care. Neither did she. At 270 feet, the character of the rock changed again, returning to the older limestone, more reliable, offering better holds in its aged fracture lines. Her pace recovered slightly. The wind remained constant, a physical presence rather than a variable, something she had stopped fighting and started working around. At 300 feet, she allowed herself a single glance upward. The top of the cliff was approximately 40 feet above her, a jagged line against a sky that had turned the color of a deep bruise. The haboob was close, not arriving. Here, the air around her was changing texture, the clean, dry heat of the desert afternoon being replaced by something heavier, grittier, carrying the first suspended particles of the wall that was rolling toward them from the west. The stars to the southwest were already gone. The last pale light of the dying day was being consumed from below, the horizon rising as the storm rose. She climbed the last 40 feet in silence, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the increasingly violent gusts that came across the face in irregular pulses. Her forearms were beyond burning. They had entered the territory of pure mechanical function, operating on the structural strength of bone and connective tissue, because the muscular system had long since run past its comfortable range. She pulled herself over the final lip of the ridge and collapsed onto the flat surface of the summit plateau. She lay there, face down on cold limestone, breathing. For perhaps 30 seconds, she allowed herself to simply be a body that had survived something difficult. Then she rolled to her stomach, pushed herself to her knees, and began to establish her position. The plateau was roughly the size of a large living room, its edges dropping away on three sides into significant exposure. The fourth side, to the east, rose in a short rock wall that provided natural concealment and wind protection. She moved to the edge that faced west and southwest, keeping her profile below the ridgeline, and set up the Shitax bipod in the gravel. She removed the protective cover from the thermal imaging unit and activated it. The world changed. The swirling, particulate-heavy air of the advancing haboob disappeared. In its place was a monochrome landscape of gray and white, every heat signature rendered in precise gradients of light against the cold stone. The thermal sensor cut through suspended dust the way daylight never could, reading the infrared radiation beneath the surface chaos. She panned down into the valley. There, 7 distinct heat signatures clustered near a group of boulders on the canyon floor. Stationary, white-hot against the cooling rock. SEAL Team Bravo, gone to ground, waiting out the storm as procedure dictated. To them, the world was a wall of sand and sound. They were navigating by memory and touch. They were, in the language of tactical assessment, completely blind. She adjusted the focus, scanned outward from the team's position in expanding arcs, checking for wildlife, checking for environmental hazards. Then she stopped. On the opposing ridge, 200 meters lower in elevation, parallel to her position and commanding a direct sightline into the canyon floor below. Movement. Not the erratic drift of tumbleweeds in moving air, not the heat shimmer of sun-warmed rock releasing its stored warmth into the cooling evening. This was rhythmic, purposeful, the movement of things that were choosing their path. She increased the magnification. 1 figure, 2, 5. She counted slowly, methodically. 9. 9 heat signatures moving along a goat trail on the opposing ridge in a spread formation with maintained tactical intervals. They were moving with the deliberate, practiced economy of people who had done this before, people who had been trained to do this. And she could see, even at this range, the way they moved, that the training had not been improvised. She increased the magnification again. The figures were carrying objects on their backs, long and tubular and heavy in a way that changed posture, that pulled shoulders back and altered the forward lean of the stride. Not rifles. She had spent 11 years learning the difference between how a person moved with a rifle on their back and how they moved with something significantly heavier. The tubular objects were too large, too unwieldy in their distribution of weight. Mortar tubes. And in the hands of the second figure, something she recognized from the profile alone, the specific shoulder width and mechanical bulk of a tube-launched weapon. RPG. These were not cartel soldiers running product through a smuggling corridor and caught out by bad weather. These were not opportunistic bandits who had stumbled across a military patrol. The formation discipline, the tactical intervals, the deliberate use of the haboob as concealment cover, the pre-positioned route along the ridge directly above the canyon floor, where 8 American operators were pinned without visibility. This was a prepared ambush, executed by people with military training. The chill that moved through her was not temperature. It was the specific recognition of a scenario she had analyzed in the TOC 2 hours ago, mapped out with her finger on a projected terrain display, while a large man blocked her view and a lieutenant told her she was luggage. She reached for her radio. Her hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, from the specific physiological response of a person whose pattern recognition has just completed a calculation with a bad answer. Alpha 1, this is Overwatch. She kept her voice as level as she could make it, pitching it to cut through the static she could already hear building in the channel. Break, break. Multiple contacts maneuvering your east flank. Elevation plus 200, approximately 400 meters from your position. They are moving with crew-served weapons. Static. A wall of white noise, dense and complete. The ionization of the haboob was scattering the radio signal the way it scattered light. The suspended particles of the storm acting as interference across every frequency simultaneously. Lieutenant Harmon, ambush is imminent. Move your team. Nothing but the hiss of the atmosphere burning itself. Through the scope, she watched the opposing ridge team stop moving. They had reached their position. Through the thermal imaging, she watched the unmistakable process of emplacement, of crew-served weapons being set up on their firing platforms with the practiced efficiency of people who had done it many times. The circular heat bloom of a mortar base plate being seated against the stone. The adjustment of the tube angle. The heat signature of a figure moving to the rear of the position with the careful, deliberate posture of someone handling a mortar round. They were ready. 8 meters and 40 seconds from delivering ordnance into a confined canyon depression where SEAL Team Bravo had no cover that would survive a direct mortar impact. The shockwave alone in that rocky bowl would be catastrophic. The fragmentation from the canyon walls would make the primary blast seem gentle. Reeve looked at the range data on her scope. 3,050 meters. She looked at the windage indicator. The haboob was pushing air across the valley in irregular gusts ranging from 30 to 50 knots. Over this distance, the crosswind drift would push a .408 projectile laterally by a distance that most ballistics charts listed as theoretical. The standard approach to a shot at this range in these conditions was to classify it as beyond practical engagement distance and look for alternatives. There were no alternatives. She looked down at the team on the canyon floor. She looked up at the opposing ridge. She looked at the figure with the mortar round, whose posture was shifting, weight transferring forward, the specific movement of someone preparing to drop a projectile down a tube. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, in calibration. She listened to the wind. This was the thing her father had tried to explain, and eventually stopped trying to explain, because explanation was not the right vehicle for it. It was not a technique. It was not a skill set that could be reduced to steps in a manual. It was the ability to be still enough and quiet enough and present enough that the environment told you things it didn't tell people who were making too much noise to hear. The wind spoke in frequency, in pressure change, in the barely perceptible acoustic shifts that occurred when a gust peaked and then fell, when the air found a momentary coherence before the next pulse of the storm disrupted it. Her father had heard it. Her mother had heard it without knowing what she was hearing. Reeve had been hearing it since she was 8 years old, standing in a Wyoming pasture with a .22 rifle, and a man who had the patience to let her discover it herself. She heard it now. A half-second lull, not a stop. A breath. The storm inhaling. She opened her eyes. She was not aiming at the figure with the mortar round. She was aiming 38 feet to his left, into empty air, into the nothing that the bullet needed to travel through to account for the wind that was not there in this breath, but would be there for every other instant of the bullet's flight. She squeezed the trigger. The ShyTac erupted. The muzzle brake channeled the expanding gases in 2 directions simultaneously, kicking up a cloud of gravel around the bipod feet. The recoil was not gentle. It found the bruising in her shoulder from the climb and drove into it with blunt, specific force. She stayed on the scope through the recoil cycle. 1 second. The bullet was 200 meters downrange, its rotation stabilizing, its supersonic tip cutting through the first layers of suspended particulate matter. 2 seconds, 1,500 meters. The crosswind was hitting the projectile, pushing it, fighting the drift compensation she had dialed into the turrets. The bullet was beginning its long arc of descent, velocity bleeding at the precise rate calculated by physics and accounted for by elevation adjustment. 3 seconds. 2,800 meters. The valley floor was below. The canyon walls were below. The bullet was crossing the thermal layer between warm and cold air, a transition that would add a fractional degree of deflection that she had accounted for. 3.8 seconds. Through the scope, the thermal image of the figure on the opposing ridge moved, not in response to sound. The shot was still traveling faster than its own acoustic signature. The figure moved because something that weighed 419 grains arrived at the location he occupied at a velocity that left no room for anything to happen except what happened. He went down. Not backward, not dramatically. He simply ceased to be upright. The mortar round fell from his hands, tumbling away from the firing position, harmless. Reeves cycled the bolt. The empty casing ejected with a crisp, metallic sound that was immediately swallowed by the wind. She settled back into the stock. 1 down, she said to no one. 8 to go. Down in the canyon, Lieutenant Cole Harmon was pressed flat against the stone of the boulder cluster, his left shoulder on fire where a ricocheted round had punched through the outer edge of his deltoid and exited clean. His left arm was functional, but unreliable, responding to commands with a half-second delay that told him the nerve was involved. The suppression fire from the ridge had been immediate and overwhelming. It had come without warning, from an elevation advantage that negated their thermal capability in the storm, from positions that offered no return fire solutions from the canyon floor. Within 60 seconds of first contact, his team was fragmented, each man isolated behind whatever cover was closest, unable to move, unable to coordinate. He had been in bad positions before. This one was different. This one had the particular geometry of a trap that had been set before he arrived. That had been designed around the route he had chosen, the timing he had established, the tactical decisions he had made in a TOC 4 hours ago, while dismissing the one voice in the room that had described this exact scenario. The tire tracks. He lay behind the boulder with his hand pressed against the exit wound in his shoulder, the blood warm against his palm, and felt the specific quality of a realization that arrived too late to be anything but a lesson. She had told him. She had stood in the talk with her finger pointed at the canyon map and described what was going to happen. She had used the word kill box. She had outlined the fire positions, the restricted movement corridors, the way air support would be stripped by weather, the way thermal advantage would invert in storm conditions. He had called her luggage. He tried the radio. The static was dense and almost complete, the haboob's ionization turning the communication channel into white noise. He keyed the microphone in rhythmic bursts rather than voice. 2 clicks. Pause. 2 clicks. The universal signal for a unit that was listening but could not transmit clearly. Intelligent static. A request. Then something happened. On the ridge above him, to his east, a figure appeared briefly on a ledge and then collapsed backward. There was no sound of a shot from his position or from any member of his team. The angle of impact was wrong for a canyon floor shooter. The figure simply dropped, the way things dropped when kinetic energy arrived from a direction and at a velocity that left no transition period between upright and not. He raised his night vision monocular with his good arm. The image was grainy and green, degraded by the particulate in the air. On the opposing ridge, a second figure dropped. Same absence of warning, same finality. The angle of the impacts was steep, too steep for a canyon floor position. Whoever was shooting was not below. They were above, and to his east. His head turned slowly toward the jagged, dark mass of Hill 3050, rising above the valley on his eastern side, its summit invisible in the swirling brown-gray of the storm. A peak he had looked at in the briefing room and dismissed as a solo hiking expedition 3 kilometers off his axis. He breathed. The name arrived in his mouth without ceremony. Hartwell, he said. The word tasted like copper and recalibration and something harder to name. He had sent her to trail the formation. She had climbed a cliff face in a haboob with a 35-pound rifle on her back and was shooting from a position he had told her was inaccessible. While he was pinned in the trap she had predicted, she had not waited for permission. She had not waited for an apology. She had simply gone and done the thing that needed doing because it was the thing that needed doing. And the mountain had not cared about her gender or her size or her rank any more than the wind cared which direction was inconvenient. He keyed the mic. 3,000 meters above, barely audible through the static, Reeve heard the rhythmic clicks in her earpiece. Intelligent, deliberate. She responded with a single transmission, flat and clinical, the voice of a tactical asset that had assessed the situation and arrived at a plan. Enemy regrouping north of your position. East flank is open. Move to the 3 o'clock ridge. I will clear the path. A pause. She watched through the thermal scope as the heat signatures of the SEAL team held still for 4 seconds. She watched Harmon process the instruction. She watched the weight of his pride move through him like weather. And then she watched him make the decision that the situation required. Copy, Overwatch, he said. His voice had changed, not weakened, recalibrated. Moving east. They broke cover and ran. A figure on the opposing ridge rose from behind a scrub line, a K raised, the thermal bloom of it clear and bright in Reeve's scope, tracking toward the exposed back of Kowalski, who was running with his SAW at low ready. She did not think about it. The trigger broke. The gunman dropped before the first shot reached his intended target. Clear, she said into the radio. Move! She cycled the bolt. She found the next target. She fired. The rhythm of it was mechanical, not cold. She would not understand until later that it had not been cold, that the absence of emotional noise during execution was not the same as the absence of feeling. But in the moment it was clean and functional, the body doing what it had been trained to do at a level below conscious decision-making, while the conscious mind managed elevation and windage and sequential target prioritization. Shot 5. Shot 6, shot 7, each kill pressing the opposing team further into fragmentation, stripping their ability to coordinate, reducing the ambush from a prepared tactical operation to a collection of frightened individuals looking for exits. The team reached the eastern ridge. For a moment she allowed herself a half-breath of something that was not quite relief. 8 signatures in new covered positions. Better geometry, defensible ground. The immediate threat had shifted. Then the sound arrived. She heard it before she saw it in the scope. The engine of something very large and very powerful being pushed at high speed across broken terrain. The mechanical roar of it moved through the canyon acoustics in a way that made her chest resonate. She swung the scope north. The vehicle emerged from the haboob like something prehistoric. A Toyota Land Cruiser with the roof cut away, an up-armored chassis that had been modified so many times it barely resembled the civilian vehicle it had started as. Mounted on the bed, a DSHK heavy machine gun, its barrel traversing as the gunner adjusted to the new position of the team on the eastern ridge. Technical. The vehicle was accelerating, not slowing to engage from distance. Closing. The driver was using speed as force multiplication, the rolling mass of the armored vehicle as a weapon in itself, and the DSHK barrel was swinging to bear on the position where Harmon's team had just taken cover. Her hand moved to the magazine pouch before the tactical assessment was fully completed. Muscle memory driving the action while the brain caught up. Her fingers found the cartridge she was looking for by its tip, which was different from the standard rounds. Harder, silver gray rather than copper, armor-piercing incendiary, 1 round. She had carried exactly 1 API round in this magazine configuration. She had carried it for 18 months, through 2 deployments, through every qualification range, and every loadout inspection. The way a person carries the thing they know they might eventually need without ever hoping they need it. She slid it into the chamber. The bolt closed. Down in the canyon, the DSHK opened fire. The heavy, rhythmic thudding of it was audible even at her distance. The rounds it fired were not suppression. They were destruction, each projectile capable of penetrating the cover the team was using, turning the rocks they were hiding behind from protection into debris. "Take the shot or we are dead." Harmon's voice was in her ear, the panic in it stripped down to its functional core. The request of a man who had run out of alternatives. "Stand by," she said. She tracked the vehicle. The driver was moving erratically, using the boulders on the canyon floor as slalom gates, varying speed and heading. She watched the pattern. She watched the path the vehicle was taking and the path it needed to take, and the places where those two paths would intersect with the physical constraints of the terrain. There was a gap between two rock formations, narrow enough that the vehicle would have to straighten its approach to thread it. The driver would brake slightly, bringing the nose down, correcting the wheel. A fraction of a second of reduced lateral movement. She did not aim at the vehicle. She aimed at the gap. She aimed at the empty air where the engine block of the vehicle would be in 3.6 seconds if the driver made the only choice the terrain allowed. She breathed out. She squeezed. The API round left the barrel at the same velocity as every other round, but it was going somewhere that no other round she had ever fired had been going. It was going to a place that did not yet exist, to intercept something that had not yet arrived there, guided by nothing except the calculations she had made and the stillness she had been trained to hold. 1 second. 2 seconds. The vehicle entered the gap. The nose dropped as the driver braked. 3 seconds. The DSHK swung to bear on the team's position. 3.6 seconds. The API round struck the engine block of the Toyota at a velocity sufficient to punch through the radiator, shatter the cast iron engine housing, and introduce an incendiary element to the fuel system in the same instant. Through the thermal scope, the result was a bloom of white that expanded outward from the vehicle's front end with the suddenness of a camera flash. The engine compartment became a sun. The force of the explosion, combined with the vehicle's forward momentum, produced something geometrically implausible. The heavy armored Toyota rotating forward, its front end rising, the entire mass pivoting over the point of impact, and continuing, landing on its roof in a shower of sparks and debris that scattered across a 30-meter radius. Secondary explosions followed as the ammunition stored in the vehicle cooked off in sequence, each one less dramatic than the last, punctuation marks on a sentence that had already ended. Reeve pulled her eye from the scope. She blinked. The after image of the thermal bloom was still printing against the inside of her eyelids. "Target destroyed," she said into the radio. "Good kill." Harmon's voice filled with a relief so complete it had stripped everything else out of it. "Good kill, Overwatch." She looked back through the scope at the burning wreck. The flames were doing something she had not calculated for. They were illuminating. The thermal bloom of the burning vehicle was casting its light up the canyon walls and, critically, up the eastern face toward Hill 3050. At this distance, the muzzle signatures of her shots had been invisible, but the trajectory of the shots could be calculated by anyone with tactical geometry training from the positions of the fallen. And the burning vehicle was now functioning as a spotlight, its flickering light reaching up toward the ridgeline where she had been firing. She watched the thermal scope. On the surviving cluster of enemy signatures below, 3 figures separated from the group. They were not retreating south. They were not moving toward the SEAL team. They were moving north, toward the base of the cliffs, toward the base of her mountain. She watched them for 4 seconds, verifying what she was seeing. "Lieutenant," she said, and her voice was quieter now, stripped of the clinical distance she had maintained through the engagement. "I'm compromised." She pushed herself up from the prone position and began to move. The surgeon's shift was over. Now she had to survive. She had approximately 4 minutes. That was the calculation she made as she pulled herself away from the scope and began moving across the summit plateau toward the choke point. 4 minutes before the first climber reached a position where he could fire upward onto the plateau with any accuracy. Possibly less, depending on their route and their fitness and how badly they wanted what was at the top. They wanted it badly enough to climb toward it in a haboob in the dark. She had to assume they wanted it very badly. The plateau was small, roughly 30 feet by 20, its surface uneven limestone gravel, interrupted by larger embedded rocks that created natural low points and raised edges. She moved across it in a crouch, keeping her profile below the outer ridgeline, cataloging the terrain with the automated efficiency of someone who had learned to read ground the way other people read text. Where the surface was firm, where it was loose, where the natural geometry of the rock created angles that could work for her rather than against her. There was only one way up. The goat trail that accessed the summit crested the plateau on its southwestern edge, emerging between two large limestone formations that acted as a natural gateway. The trail itself was the only negotiable approach to the summit. The other three sides of the plateau dropped away in exposures, ranging from significant to unsurvivable. Anyone coming up was coming through that gateway. She set the shy tack down against the eastern rock wall with care that was automatic rather than considered. The rifle had saved 8 lives in the last 20 minutes. It was also at close quarters, 35 pounds of bolt-action precision instrument that required distance to function. At 15 feet, it was a club, an expensive, beautifully engineered club. She pulled the M18A1 Claymore mine from the bottom of her pack. The green plastic casing was curved and dense, roughly the size and shape of a thick cutting board. Stamped on the face in raised letters was the instruction that every soldier who had ever handled one knew by heart. Front toward enemy. She had always found a certain blunt honesty in that. No ambiguity, no tactical nuance, just a direction and an expectation. She set the scissor legs against the rocky soil 3 feet back from the gateway, angling the convex face down the trail at the angle that would give the kill zone maximum coverage of the emerging space. She pressed the legs in as far as the hard-packed surface would allow, tested the stability with 2 fingers, adjusted the angle 2 degrees to the right. She had no time for a tripwire configuration. This was going to be manual. She was going to have to see them, judge the moment, and squeeze the M57 firing device at the precise instant when the maximum number of bodies were inside the kill zone. She unspooled the firing wire back to the eastern wall, moving in a low crouch, pressing the wire into the gravel with her boot as she went to reduce the chance of it being visible. She connected the wire to the clacker. The small, hand-sized device, with its characteristic squeeze handle, sat in her right palm with a weight that felt entirely disproportionate to what it could do. She checked her belt. The Sig Sauer P226 was in her drop holster on her right thigh. She drew it, cleared the chamber check, saw brass, reholstered. Her combat knife was in its sheath on her left shoulder rig. She drew it and drove the point into the gravel beside her position. She wanted it accessible without requiring her to think about accessing it. She pressed herself against the eastern rock wall and waited. The wind across the summit had reached a consistent 40 knots, gusting higher at irregular intervals, producing a sound that was part roar and part scream, and entirely disorienting to anyone trying to listen through it. She controlled her breathing. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold, 2 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. Repeat. The kind of breathing that slowed the heart rate by force of discipline rather than circumstance. Her left leg was responding badly. The rock that had struck her thigh during the claymore placement had hit in a location where the nerve ran close to the surface, and the resulting numbness was spreading upward and downward from the impact point in a way that told her the leg would be unreliable if she needed to move fast. She filed that information and set it aside. She heard them before she saw anything. Not voices. The wind was too loud for voices to carry. What she heard was the scrape of boot leather against stone. The specific sound of a weighted footstep on a surface that wasn't quite stable, searching for purchase. Then the controlled exhalation of someone who had been climbing for several minutes at altitude and was managing their oxygen carefully. These were not panicked men scrambling up a cliff face. They were moving with discipline. A hand appeared over the southwestern lip of the plateau. Thick fingers gripping the edge, testing it, then the forearm, then the shoulder and the head wrapped in a dark shemagh, eyes scanning the plateau in a single sweeping motion. He found her immediately. She was 10 feet away, pressed against the eastern wall, the clacker in her right hand and the sig in her left, watching him with a specific quality of attention that had no performance in it at all. He registered her size. He registered that she was alone. He registered the absence of the team he had presumably expected. His eyes moved to the claymore, which was 3 feet in front of him, and she watched him recognize what it was. For one complete second, he was perfectly still. He began to raise the AK-47. He called back over his shoulder, one sharp word in a language she didn't speak, and she heard the response from below the lip. 2 voices, both close. He stepped fully onto the plateau to clear the gateway for the men behind him. She squeezed the clacker 3 times. Click, click, click. The claymore discharged. The sound of it was not an explosion in the conventional sense, although it was that too. It was a pressure event. 700 steel ball bearings traveling at 4,000 feet per second in a 60-degree arc, released simultaneously, the overpressure wave preceding the fragmentation by a fraction of a second and arriving at every surface within 30 feet as a physical blow. The concussive force hit her against the rock wall like a flat hand, hard and total, driving the air from her lungs and pressing her into the stone. The sound arrived and then was gone, replaced by a ringing that occupied the entire frequency range of her hearing and left no room for anything else. The gateway was gone. The claymore's discharge had struck the 2 large limestone formations flanking the trail entrance at their base, and the overpressure, combined with the pre-existing instability of the outer cliff edge, had done something she had not specifically planned for, but had understood was possible. The edge of the plateau had given way. 40 feet of outer ridgeline, loosened by the blast, had separated from the mountain and fallen. The goat trail was gone. The first climber was gone. The 2 men behind him were gone. Reeve sat against the eastern wall with her ears ringing and her vision strobing at the edges and took stock. The plateau was smaller now. The southwestern corner was simply absent, a new cliff edge standing where the gateway had been, dropping away into the swirling brown darkness of the storm below. She had sealed the only way up. She had also sealed the only way down. Her hearing was returning in fragments, the ringing giving way to a high-pitched static that was slowly resolving into the sound of the wind. She ran her left hand across her face. It came away with a mixture of dust and blood from a gash across her cheekbone where flying limestone had found her. Her right thigh, where the claymore's overpressure had driven her leg against the wall, was adding a new layer of damage to the existing nerve injury. She sat still for a moment. Then she remembered there had been 4. She had counted 4 heat signatures separating from the main group below. 3 had come up the goat trail. She had not tracked the 4th. The eastern rock formation that formed her position anchor had blocked that thermal angle completely. A blind spot she had noted and then discounted because the face it concealed was vertical and smooth, and she had classified it as unclimbable. She had classified it the same way Harmon had classified Hill 3050. She had assumed. The sound came from her right, from the eastern wall that she had been pressing her back against, not from below it or above it, from the top of it, from the short rock formation that she had identified as natural cover and concealment and had been using as her position anchor for the last 8 minutes. A boot appeared on top of the wall, then a leg, then the rest of a man who had climbed the eastern face, the face she had looked at and classified as unclimbable, and was now pulling himself over the edge directly above her with an AK-47 across his chest, and the specific expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected. He was 6 feet away. She brought the SIG up and fired twice. The shots were close enough together to sound like one. At 6 feet, in the dark, with a secondary weapon she had fired thousands of rounds through, the margin of error was 0, and she used none of it. He came off the wall and did not rise. The silence after the shots was different from the silence that had preceded them. Reeve lowered the SIG. Her left arm dropped to her side. She sat against the eastern wall that no longer felt like cover and looked at the new cliff edge where the southwestern corner of the plateau had been. And she felt the particular exhaustion of a body that has been operating beyond sustainable parameters for longer than it had resources to cover. She was alive. The path down was gone. She keyed her radio. The signal was still degraded but improving as the Haboob's main body moved east, its electrical interference moving with it. "Lieutenant," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, the resonance of the Claymore's overpressure still resident in her chest. "Compromised. Extraction route is gone. Summit is clear." Static. Then Harmon's voice, closer than she expected, the signal sharper. "Weston, what is your status?" "Ambulatory, barely." She looked at her leg. "Sitting on top of a rock with no way down." A pause, long enough that she began to calculate alternatives and found none that were survivable in her current condition. "Hold your position," Harmon said. His voice had the quality she recognized from the briefing room, the quality of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it. Except the decision was different now. It was not about mission parameters or tactical geometry. It was not about what was efficient or procedurally correct. "We are not leaving without you." She didn't respond. She wasn't sure what she would have said. She pressed herself to the new edge of the plateau, lying flat, looking down into the canyon. The burning wreck of the Technical was still producing light below, its flames casting long, wavering shadows up the canyon walls. And there, at the base of the valley's extraction point, the dark shape of something that was growing, taking on mass and dimension as it descended from the southwest. The Black Hawk. Its running lights were off. It moved through the dying Haboob with the careful, precise movements of a pilot navigating on instruments, feeling for the canyon floor with sensors rather than sight. The rotor wash pushed the suspended dust outward in a slow ring as it descended. She watched the team converge on the extraction point, 8 signatures moving from covered positions toward the landing zone with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. She watched them reach the flat hardpack. She watched the helicopters settle toward the ground. She watched them stop. They were not boarding. 8 men standing in a defensive perimeter at the base of the valley, facing outward, weapons up. The helicopter was on the ground and no one was getting in. They were waiting. Then she saw the light, a single point of burning orange rising from the extraction point, arcing upward toward the eastern cliffs in a long, slow parabola, leaving a trail of smoke and sparks that the wind tore apart almost immediately. A flare. Not the kind you fired to mark a landing zone for a pilot who already knew where to land. The kind you fired when you needed something else entirely to see you. It reached the height of the cliff face and burned there against the brown sky for 4 seconds before the current took it east and it faded into nothing. She had not been signaling them. They had been signaling her. Something shifted in her chest that she did not have immediate vocabulary for. She had spent 11 years in environments where she was tolerated or doubted or dismissed or actively excluded. She had built her entire professional identity on the understanding that the only currency that mattered was performance, and that performance would never be enough for certain people, regardless of its quality, and that the correct response to this was to perform anyway and withhold the expectation of recognition. To need nothing from anyone in a uniform, to make herself an island of one and fortify it well. 8 men standing in an extraction zone in the dying edge of a Haboob, refusing to board a helicopter, firing a flare at a cliff face to tell one person on top of it that they were not leaving. It turned out the island had a shore. She had just never let anyone close enough to find it. She looked at the scree slope. It descended from the base of the plateau's northern edge in a long, steep pitch of loose shale and fractured limestone, the kind of surface that was dangerous to walk on, even slowly, and nearly unsurvivable to descend at speed. The pitch was approximately 50 degrees. The vertical drop before it leveled was close to 500 feet. The surface was entirely loose material, nothing compacted, nothing anchored. She looked at it for a long time. Her father had told her once, on a Wyoming winter morning when she was 14, and had refused to come down off a frozen hillside because she couldn't find a safe route, that the difference between a problem and an obstacle was mostly a matter of perspective and the willingness to redefine what safe meant in context. She had thought he was being philosophical. He had been being practical. She tightened every strap on her pack. The chai tack was secured against her back with every attachment point closed. She checked the SIG, safed it, holstered it. She found the largest flat piece of limestone on what remained of the plateau surface. Roughly 2 feet by 18 inches, its underside smooth where it had been a floor section before the blast had lifted it. She picked it up and held it against her chest. She stood at the top of the scree slope. She looked down 500 feet of loose rock in darkness, and the particular variety of gravity that did not negotiate. She thought about the wind. She thought about her father standing in a Wyoming pasture with the specific patience of a man who understood that some things could only be taught by stepping back and letting them happen. She thought about her mother standing in the yard on windy mornings, listening for something she couldn't name, knowing it mattered without knowing why. She thought about a flare burning orange against a brown sky for 4 seconds. She stepped off. The first second was pure fall. The loose surface provided no resistance to the initial impact, absorbing her weight and releasing it instantly, and she was moving before she had consciously committed to the motion. The limestone slab under her boots acted as a ski, spreading her weight across a larger surface area than her boots alone would have covered, distributing the pressure that would otherwise have driven her feet through the loose material and stopped her violently. She was not descending the slope. She was surfing it. The speed built faster than she had calculated. The upper layer of shale granules moved almost like liquid under the slab, flowing around and beneath her, carrying her downward with a momentum that was rapidly becoming its own decision-maker. She used the rifle butt against the surface on her right side as a brake, dragging it through the loose material, feeling the resistance travel up through her already damaged shoulder. She used her left heel in pulses, digging in and releasing, steering rather than stopping. Dust billowed around her in a personal storm. Rocks moved with her, the avalanche of her passage collecting debris as it went. She kept her eyes forward and down, reading the surface for anything solid enough to redirect her at this speed. A boulder would end this instantly and badly. She saw one coming, shifted her weight left, felt the slide respond, passed it on the right side with 2 feet of margin that felt like nothing. 400 feet, 300, 2. Movement on the slope. Kowalski's voice, carrying across the extraction point with a volume that cut through rotor noise without effort. Northwest face, fast. She hit the transition point where the steep pitch met the flatter canyon floor with a force that drove through her ankles and knees and upward through her spine in a single jarring instant. She was still moving. The flat ground redirected her rather than stopped her, and she was rolling before the physics of the situation had fully resolved. Arms wrapped around her head, the shy tack absorbing impacts across her back that would otherwise have found bone. She stopped, face up, sky above her, brown and thinning. The rotor wash of the Black Hawk pressing down from 50 meters away like a warm, mechanical hand. She lay still, alive. She heard boots on hardpack, running, getting louder fast. She turned her head and saw Kowalski covering the distance between the helicopter and her position at a speed that a man his size had no business achieving. Dex Callum was 2 steps behind him, medical bag already open, bouncing against his hip with each stride. She tried to sit up. Her left leg did not cooperate. Kowalski reached her first. He dropped to one knee beside her, his hands moving across her with a rapid, systematic assessment of someone checking for the injuries that killed you before the ones that only hurt. He found the leg. He found the face. He found the hands. His expression moved through several things in quick succession, settling finally on something she had not expected from him and did not have a ready category for. He put one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees. He lifted her the way you lifted something you understood the value of. Not carefully because she was fragile, carefully because she wasn't, and he knew it now, and that knowledge had changed the geometry of everything. "I got you," he said. The rotor wash made the words almost inaudible, but she read them clearly, both of them. "I got you, Weston." Not doll, Weston. She didn't have the energy to mark it in the moment. She filed it somewhere close to the surface, where she would find it later, and let him carry her. The interior of the MH-60 was noise and vibration and the smell of hydraulic fluid and the particular metallic sweetness of blood that had been drying in a confined metal space for too long. Kowalski set her on the canvas webbing of the troop seat with a deliberateness that was completely inconsistent with everything she had previously understood about him. Callum was in front of her immediately, cutting away the trouser leg above the injury, his hands efficient and unhurried, in the way of someone who had done this in worse conditions and was not going to be rushed by proximity to a helicopter. Harmon was across the cabin. His left arm was in an improvised sling fashioned from a cut section of load-bearing vest. His face was the color of old concrete, pale beneath the grime and dried blood at his hairline. He was watching her with an expression she needed a moment to identify. She had seen respect before. She had seen the professional acknowledgement of competence, the grudging recognition that performance sometimes demanded. She had seen men recalibrate their assessments of her in the field and understood that the recalibration was tactical rather than personal, that it would evaporate the moment the mission ended and the old categories reasserted themselves. This was not that. This was something that had moved below the professional level and lodged in a place that professional recalibration did not reach. She recognized it because she had seen it only a handful of times in her career, and each time it had been one person looking at another after surviving something that neither of them expected to survive. He said something. The rotor noise swallowed it completely. He leaned forward and said it again. She read his lips. "Check her first." It was directed at Callum, who was already working on her leg without being told, who had sprinted across the extraction point without waiting for an order. Harmon had said it anyway, with his own shoulder wound still unaddressed and his left arm hanging in a makeshift sling, because there was something in him that needed to say it out loud, regardless of whether it changed anything. It was the sentence he owed her, and he was paying it in the smallest available denomination. And he knew that, and he said it anyway. Callum pressed an antiseptic pad to the laceration on her cheek. She hissed through her teeth. He moved to the leg, working through the assessment with pressure tests that mapped the damage without being gentle about it. Deep contusion, nerve compression, probably temporary, the kind of injury that would sideline her for weeks and leave no permanent mark worth mentioning. She would take it. Kowalski was sitting across from her with his big hands hanging loose between his knees, looking at the Shytac that was still lying across her lap. She had not let go of it. Even now in the cabin, in the aftermath of everything, her hands were wrapped around the receiver with the grip of someone whose nervous system had not yet received the signal that the work was finished. The gloves were shredded at every fingertip. The fabric was soaked through with blood that had dried to a dark rust color during the climb, that felt like it had happened to someone else, in a different hour, on a different mountain. Kowalski reached over and touched the arm of the man beside him. He pointed at her hands without saying anything. The man looked, said nothing. Kowalski pointed for Callum. Callum looked at her hands, then at Kowalski, and something passed between them that occupied no airspace and required no volume. The specific communication of men who had processed a lot of information together and had learned to do it efficiently. She had torn her hands apart on that cliff face, grip by grip, hold by hold, bleeding through the gloves for 300 feet of vertical rock, carrying a rifle that weighed more than most people could comfortably lift, in a haboob, alone, after being told she was luggage. And she had done it not because anyone expected her to. She had done it because 8 men were going to die in a canyon if she didn't, and she was the only person in a position to prevent it, and that was a sufficient reason. Harmon leaned forward. He reached into the left breast pocket of her jacket with 2 fingers, the gesture careful, almost tentative, as though asking a question with his hand rather than his voice. She watched him and did not stop him. He found the tactical notebook. It was small and battered, its cover darkened at the corner with something that was probably blood and probably hers. He held it in his good hand for a moment without opening it, just held it. This small object that had ridden in the pocket of a woman he had categorized and dismissed and very nearly gotten killed, and something in the set of his jaw said that he understood exactly what he was holding and what it represented and what it cost. Then he opened it. She watched his eyes move across the pages, the mission prep notes from the flight to Iron Gate, the wind readings she had taken at the ridge before the haboob arrived, the ballistic calculations she had worked out and revised again, on the patrol, on the cliff face, in the dark with the storm consuming everything below her. Pages of small, precise handwriting in the shorthand she had developed over years of working alone. Numbers and angles and variables that told the complete story of every decision she had made from the moment she stepped off that C-130 until the moment the last casing hit the limestone. He reached the last page. He read what she had written there the night before. She watched his face as he read it. She watched the expression move through something that was complex and unresolvable. The specific expression of a person encountering a truth about themselves inside someone else's private record of it. The words were not about him. They had not been written for him, but they described the distance between what he had seen and what had actually been there. And he understood that, and the understanding cost him something visible. Then he turned to the blank page. He found the pen on his shoulder strap, uncapped it with his teeth, held the notebook against his knee. He wrote slowly, with the deliberateness of a man choosing each word not for how it sounded, but for whether it was accurate, whether it was true, whether it was the thing that actually needed to be said rather than the thing that was easier. He closed the notebook. He held it out to her. She took it, looked at what he had written on the blank page behind the last entry. She came back. She was right. Harmon. 7 words, no decoration, no qualification. The sentence that acknowledged everything without performing the acknowledgement, that said what had happened and attributed it correctly and put his name on it in ink that would not wash out. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her eyes with the steadiness of a man who had decided to stop looking away from things that were uncomfortable to see. It had cost him something to get there. She could see the cost. She did not discount it. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. The Black Hawk banked left, climbing out of the canyon into the clearing sky above the haboob's eastern trailing edge. Through the small porthole she could see the storm below, the vast brown expanse of it moving eastward across the desert floor, already beginning to thin where it was running out of momentum. The canyon was disappearing beneath them. The burning technical was a small orange point in the darkness below, growing smaller. She looked at her hands. Slowly, with the careful attention of someone relearning the sequence, she loosened her grip on the Shitak. She set the rifle across her knees. She checked the safety with her thumb. She closed her eyes. The counselor's name was Patricia Home, and her office in Tucson smelled of recycled air and the particular institutional calm of a room where difficult things were regularly said and somehow survived. She was 53, with reading glasses on a chain, and 20 years of practice at sitting across from people who had done things that required professional help to metabolize. Reeves sat across from her 3 weeks after Diablo Canyon, her left leg extended to accommodate the healing, The scar line on her cheek reduced to something that was already becoming part of her face, rather than a wound on it. She slept better than she had the first week. The first week, she had not slept in any meaningful sense. She had lain on the bunk in Iron Gate's medical bay and closed her eyes and found that closing her eyes was not rest, because closing her eyes produced the thermal scope and the white heat signatures collapsing one after another, and the arithmetic of what she had done rendered in its most clinical terms. 9. A distance, a time of flight, repeated until the sequence lost its edges and became something she could carry without it cutting her. She had not broken, but she had bent in ways she was still measuring, and measuring them here, in this chair, across from this woman with the reading glasses and the 20 years, was part of how the bending became something other than permanent. "Do you regret it?" Holm asked. Reeve looked out the window. Blue sky, high, thin clouds, two pigeons on a light pole who had no investment in her answer. "I regret they made it necessary," she said. Holm wrote something. Reeve had stopped trying to read it. It wasn't for her. "The men who dismissed you," Holm said, "do you feel differently about them now?" Reeve was quiet for a moment. She thought about the flare, the arc of it rising from the extraction point, burning orange against the brown sky for 4 seconds before the wind took it. She thought about Kowalski's hands, large and careful, and the word he had chosen when the other word would have been easier. She thought about the notebook and the 7 words written on the blank page, and what it had cost Harmon to write them, without making them sound like anything other than what they were. She thought about Callum, who had read her file the night before the mission, who had not laughed on the tarmac, who had said nothing to anyone and remembered everything, who had been the one to fire the flare. She had not known that until Harmon told her in the helicopter. Callum had not mentioned it. She was coming to understand that he was not the kind of person who mentioned things like that. "People are capable of more than the first thing they show you," she said. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was not exoneration. It was the precise observation of someone who had decided to be accurate about what things were rather than what she wished they had been or feared they still were. Most of them anyway. She meant it. She had not always been sure she would. 3 days before Tucson, Colonel Merrick Sterling had looked up from the preliminary after-action report with the expression of a man preparing to dispense recognition. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Harmon. Intelligence confirms 9 hostiles, KIA. Your team extracted without fatalities from a prepared ambush. That's the kind of result that warrants significant recognition." Harmon stood at parade rest across the desk. His arm was in the sling. He would be in it for 6 more weeks. "The report is incomplete, sir," he said. Sterling's expression did not change. "Incomplete. My team was effectively neutralized within the first 30 seconds of contact. Pinned, blind, taking casualties, no air support, no communication." He stepped forward and opened the file on the colonel's desk to the action summary page. He took the pen from the desk without asking. He wrote in the clean block letters of a man making a permanent record. "The only reason any of us extracted is because Specialist Weston reached a position I had evaluated as inaccessible, from which she eliminated the threat at distances I had considered outside practical engagement parameters, using no wind measurement equipment, in Haboob conditions, alone." He capped the pen. "Mission success. Specialist Reeve Weston. 9 confirmed kills. 3,050 meters. Chitak M200. Unaided wind estimation. If there's a medal attached to this operation, sir, it belongs to her. All of it." Sterling looked at what had been written. He looked at Harmon. He looked at the line Harmon had drawn beneath the words, "Final and without decoration." "The record will reflect the reality," Sterling said. It was the right answer. Harmon had not been certain it would be, and the uncertainty had not changed what he was going to say. The chow hall at FOB Iron Gate was loud at the dinner hour and quieter by the time the crowd thinned. Reeve sat at the small corner table with her back to the wall, which was not a choice she made consciously anymore. It was simply how she sat, back to the wall, sight lines to the door. The configuration of someone who had learned early that awareness was free and inattention was not. She was on the phone. It rang 3 times. "Hey, baby girl," Garrett Weston's voice, 61 years old and carrying all of them in the best possible way. Wyoming and patience, and the specific warmth of a man who had been waiting for this call and was not going to let her feel the weight of the waiting. "Hey, Dad, you sound different." She considered this. Her fingers were healing, the new skin at the tips still tender, still registering temperature and pressure with the heightened attention of tissue that had recently been reminded of its own vulnerability. "I am different." Good different or bad different? "I don't know yet." A pause. "Dad, I heard it." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind they usually shared. It was the kind that existed when something significant had finally been said, and both people needed a moment for it to settle into its proper place before either of them moved. "I know," he said. His voice was rough at its edges in a way it wasn't usually. "I know you did. You were right about Mom. She would have been proud of you." A pause that was full rather than empty. "I'm proud of you." She was still holding that when the door opened across the chow hall. SEAL Team Bravo came in with the particular synchronized weight of a unit that moved together even in civilian space, even cleaned up and in PT gear, even 3 days removed from the worst night most of them had probably experienced. They had the slightly unfocused quality of men who had slept the deep animal sleep of people who survived something significant and were still metabolizing the fact of it. She watched them over the phone without moving her head. They always took the center table. It was an unspoken arrangement, the kind of arrangement that didn't need to be spoken because everyone in the room already understood it. The center table was where Team Bravo sat because they were Team Bravo, and the room organized itself around that understanding without requiring discussion. Harmon walked past the center table. He walked to her corner. He set his tray down on the table directly opposite her. He did not ask. He pulled out the metal chair and sat, his large frame settling into the small space with the deliberateness of a man executing a decision he had already fully made. The scrape of the chair on the floor was loud enough to turn heads. Then Kowalski. His tray landed next to Harmon's with a clatter he made no attempt to moderate. He dragged a chair from the adjacent empty table and dropped into it with the comfortable confidence of someone claiming territory that was already his. Then Callum. He set his tray down without drama, the way a man sat when he had made his decision the night before and was simply following through on it now. He had been the one to fire the flare, standing at the extraction point in the dying Haboob with the team around him, choosing to send light upward toward a cliff face rather than a landing zone. She had not known that until Harmon told her on the helicopter. Callum had not mentioned it. He was not. She was understanding more clearly by the moment, the kind of person who mentioned things like that. He would simply do the thing that needed doing, quietly, and let it speak for itself. She recognized that. Then the rest of them, one by one, pulling chairs from wherever chairs were available, dragging them across the floor with a collective noise that had long since abandoned any pretense of discretion and become something else entirely. Something deliberate, something that was making a statement in the oldest possible language. The language of where you put your body in a room and who you put it next to, and whether you do it in a way that other people can see. The chow hall noticed. It could not notice. An officer at an enlisted specialist's corner table. A SEAL team arranged around a support attachment in the room's least prominent position. The social geometry of it was sufficiently outside normal parameters that conversations paused, heads turned, assessments were made, and then, one by one, people turned back to their own meals and filed what they had seen in the category of things that were self-explanatory. Kowalski opened a carton of milk. He looked across the table at Reeve with the expression of a man who had chosen his words carefully and was now delivering them in the least complicated form available. "Pass the salt, Weston," he said. The names sat in the air between them. Not doll, not mascot, not sweetheart or luggage, or the 100 small categorizations that had been applied to her across the years, with the casual confidence of people who believed they were simply describing what they observed. All of those words had been about who they thought she was before they knew anything about her. Weston was her name, her actual name, said by a man who had spent 2 days using something else, said now with the weight of someone who understood the difference and was making the choice publicly and without qualification. She looked at Harmon. He was looking at his food with the settled attention of a man who had said what needed saying in the ways that mattered and was done with performance. He had written in her notebook. He had rewritten the mission record in ink on the colonel's desk. He had walked to her table in front of everyone in this room. He was finished with gestures. He was eating dinner. She picked up the salt shaker. She slid it across the table to Kowalski. "Here," she said. Around her the conversation started, the way it always started when the silence had done its necessary work. Slowly, and then with its own momentum. Callum said something to the man beside him. Someone at the far end made a comment she didn't catch. Harmon looked up and responded to something with a half-smile that reached the corner of his eyes. The expression of a man who was present in the room rather than managing it. She ate. She was in the conversation without being the center of it. She was at the table without being the subject of the table. She was present in the room the way a person was present when the room had decided to include them rather than accommodate them, which were two entirely different things, and she had spent long enough experiencing one to know the difference when she felt the other. The sun through the western windows was low and amber, the long, late light of a desert afternoon that made everything it touched look as though it had always been exactly there, always been part of the landscape, always belonged to it and been belonged to by it. It crossed the floor in long diagonal bands and reached the far wall. And on that wall, the shadows of 9 people sitting at a corner table stretched upward in the distorted geometry of late daylight. One of those shadows was smaller than the others at its origin point, narrower at the shoulder, lower where it began. But the wall was the same height for all of them. The wall didn't care about rank or weight or inches or the names other people had decided to use. It only showed you what was there, the shape of the light that something solid had displaced. And in that light, on that wall, in the amber of a late Arizona afternoon, Reeve Weston's shadow stood exactly as tall as every other person in the room. She had always been 5'1". She had never been small.